Unhappy news: the Ricky Nelson mystery has been solved. One of the first genuine rock and roll icons to ever live in the United States died in a fiery meteor crash on New Year's Eve 1985. Tragically, Ricky Nelson passed away at the young age of 45. He was a television baby who helped bring rock and roll to Middle America and battled his way out of obscurity with quiet dignity. For a long time, people said it was just another tragic rock and roll event. Drugs were whispered about in the press. Technical issues and pilot mistake were mentioned in the official reports. As another cautionary tale about the perils of celebrity excess, the story was filed aside. What if, however, our assumptions on Ricky Nelson's demise were completely incorrect? In light of new information, the original narrative has changed to one of carelessness, cost cutting, and the cover-up of a preventable disaster in order to safeguard influential interests. What we once thought about Ricky Nelson's death has changed now that the truth is out in the open. His legacy becomes much more unsettling as a result, shifting it from a cautionary story, one who fell prey to a system that prioritized profits over people. How the fire began is no longer the only question. That's who was aware of the plane's hazard level. So who allowed it to fly in the first place? And whose job was it to make sure an undefended corpse would be the one to take the hit? I reconsidered. Instead, I visited the library. You had no idea I was going to order albums, did you? Oh, from little star to rock legend. To grasp the gravity of Ricky Nelson's passing, and the powers that are trying to shape the story around it, one must be familiar with his life and the cultural impact he had on the United States. Ricky Nelson was more than just a celebrity. Every American family's life revolved around him. As the son on the longest-running family sitcom on television, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, he grew up in America's Live in 1952 to 1966. Millions of people throughout the United States were unprecedentedly close to the Nelson family as they watched fictionalized versions of their lives on television week after week. There was more to the Nelson family than meets the eye. According to Dr. Margaret Chen, a popular culture historian, it was America's idealized self-portrait. Suburban living that is healthy, wealthy, and trouble-free. Ricky was the focal point of the idyllic American family life that Ozzie and Harriet Nelson painted. Our next-door all-American boy. Because of this meticulously constructed picture, the subsequent events were even more revolutionary. Wanting to win over a woman in 1957, a 16-year-old Ricky requested to play a Fats Domino song on the show. As a result of his rendition of I'm Walking, he received millions of fan letters and set in motion one of the most unexpected comebacks in the history of show business. The once innocent child from a sitcom become a real rock star. Music historian Alan Parker points out that, although being overshadowed by Elvis Presley, Ricky Nelson was an important character in the early days of rock and roll. When it came to mainstream American households, Nelson was more instrumental in getting rock on. Afraid of Elvis, parents. Once a week, Ricky would already be in their living rooms. The white middle class in America was able to listen to rock and roll because of him. With 30 top 40 songs between 1962, Nelson surpassed all artists except Pat Boone and Elvis. His silky voice and subtle delivery were on display in songs such as Poor Little Fool, Lonesome Town, Hello Mary Lou, and Traveling Man. The late, great guitarist James Burton, who would go on to perform with Elvis, was a member of the top early rock and roll band that he secretly put together. Parker maintains that Nelson was not a manufactured teen idol. He surrounded himself with world-class musicians and had true musical sensibilities. Numerous musicians were affected by his laid-back singing style and the clean tone of his albums. Nelson insisted on recording with his touring band instead of studio musicians, which allowed him to keep creative control over his music, unlike many teen idols. Groundbreaking when it was released. He had complete creative control over the album's composition, arrangement, and production, and he even wrote a few songs himself. It was the early 1960s, and Ricky Nelson had established himself as a singular figure in American popular music. He had successfully traversed the perilous seas of child celebrity and emerged as an adult artist with genuine credibility. He went from being a bona fide rock and roll pioneer to a television star. He had garnered the admiration of his fellow musicians while keeping his image spotless. However, a sea change occurred in popular culture as the 1960s continued. The Beatles' invasion of Britain revolutionized rock music. As time went on, Nelson's signature soft rockabilly and pop tone sounded antiquated. By 1964, Nelson was having a hard time keeping up with the ever-changing music industry and had seen a significant decline in his chart triumphs. Ricky Nelson, who now goes by the name Rick, experienced the same problem that plagues so many former child stars: the need to reinvent himself as the innocent Aussie, and Harriet days faded from memory. He would succeed in the end, unlike most others. The second half of his extraordinary career would be defined by his brave stance for creative integrity, which he achieved after spending years in the wilderness. No. It was penned by an Australian individual. Around the world?
Yeah.
Is that so? Oh, sure. Descend and recuperation. For Rick Nelson, the 60s were a terrible time. It appeared as though Nelson's smooth image and voice were completely at odds with the times, when psychedelia, hard rock, and protest songs were dominating the airwaves. People stopped showing up to concerts. Sales hit a new low. The music industry started to view him as an act from a bygone, simpler time, something that America had abandoned. Sarah Thompson, a music journalist, says it was a typical example of a celebrity being stifled by their own fame. Everyone in the business and in the audience couldn't get Rick Nelson out of the role of teen hero Ricky Nelson. They were too attached to his past self to accept him as an artist in constant development. In 1971, at a Madison Square Garden rock and roll revival concert, Nelson hit rock bottom as he tried to play some of his more recent, modern songs. The crowd chanted for his earlier songs and booed him. Nelson stormed off stage, humiliated yet resolute. When it came to the Madison Square Garden incident, Thompson says it was crucial. It might have utterly shattered him. The opposite happened. It spawned the song that many think is his best. Garden Party, a seemingly energetic country rock tune with a strong message on creative integrity, is Nelson's way of expressing himself after that humiliation. To succeed, you must prioritize your own happiness above all else. The 1972 single peaked at number 6 on Billboard's Hot 100, an anthem for musicians fighting against industry and audience expectations. It was his first top 10 hit in 10 years. Garden Party wasn't merely a successful return, as Parker points out. The document served as a proclamation of autonomy. Instead of just rehashing his earlier work, Nelson was standing up for his ability to develop as a musician and trust his gut. Along with this artistic revival came a major shift in musical style. When Nelson formed the Stone Canyon Band, he dove headfirst into the country rock sound that would come to define the 1970s. While his later albums, such as Garden Party and Windfall, did not achieve the same level of economic success as his earlier work, they did receive critical praise. According to Parker, the style of California country rock that would later be popularized by groups like the Eagles had its roots in Nelson and the Stone Canyon Band. Before the name Americana was even coined, they were performing music that authentically fused country and rock styles. Even though the general public didn't quite get Nelson's work at the time, musicians understood and admired it. Nelson maintained a steady touring schedule in the 1970s, winning over fans who loved his fresh sound. Even while he wasn't selling out arenas anymore, he was finally establishing himself as an artist who could hold his own as an adult, not merely a former teen idol. According to Thompson, Nelson's path is truly inspiring. He might have made a living for decades performing nostalgic tours, selling only his songs from the 50s and 60s. He would rather have taken the more difficult road of artistic development, following his inspiration regardless of the financial toll it took. That requires true bravery and belief. Nelson had found his stride by the early 80s. He kept up a regular touring schedule, even after he had fallen from the top of the charts, performing both his older hits and his more recent songs to enthusiastic crowds. He had accomplished what very few child stars ever do: go from beloved youth hero to esteemed veteran. Tragic endings to these challenging one-act plays were completely unexpected. A devastating crash that claimed Nelson's life and had the potential to tarnish his reputation due to speculation, sensationalism, and a general lack of knowledge about what transpired on New Year's Eve. My own family of 3 is growing, and I'm getting on in years. Out of the 4, I am expecting a 5th. Rick Nelson's public persona is putting pressure on his family. A more nuanced reality impacted by family dynamics, especially his connection with his mother, Harriet Nelson, existed alongside his personas as the ideal American adolescent and the laid-back rock star. Harriet Nelson was more than simply Rick's mom. According to Joel Selvin, a chronicler of the Nelson family, she was the mastermind behind the entire Nelson family image. Throughout Rick's personal life, even into adulthood, she exerted strict control over the public's perception of the family. All through Rick's life, this command showed itself in various forms. His job choices were heavily influenced by Harriet, who meticulously oversaw his money, kept tabs on his public appearances, and more. Notably, she was quite involved in his sexual relationships and didn't hesitate to tell him, when she thought he was with the wrong lady, Rick should wed someone who would keep the Nelson family reputation intact. According to Harriet's plan, this person should not pose a threat to her influence in Rick's life, remarks Selvin. Harriet was originally happy for Rick when he started seeing Kristen Harmon in the 60s. Kristen was born to devout parents. She appeared to be the ideal Nelson wife, and her brother was the actor Mark Harmon. Rick was 23 years old and Kristen was 18 years old when they were married in April 1963. 6 months later, a daughter named Tracy was born to them. In 1967, they welcomed twin sons Gunnar and Matthew, and in 1974, they welcomed a son named Sam. They seemed, at first glance, to be carrying on the Nelson family's legacy of good housekeeping. But the truth was much more chaotic. Rick and Kristen, as their marriage developed, both battled the demands of upholding the ideal Nelson image. In retrospect, Kristen said that the weight of Harriet's lingering influence and the lofty expectations placed on the Nelson family made her feel stifled. According to John Boland, a musician and friend of the family, Rick's relationship with Kristen was progressively tense during the 1970s. It was a very stressful situation. In an effort to keep his profession going and provide for his expanding family, Rick was on the go all the time, in addition to coping with Harriet's continual presence in her children's life. Kristen was practically raising 4 children alone. Substance misuse had become a problem for Rick and Kristen by the late 1970s. Cocaine was Rick's main substance of choice, while alcohol was Kristen's. Their 19-year marriage devolved into an endless loop of reconciliations and separations, before they ultimately filed for a divorce in 1982. Boland remembers that Rick had a really hard time getting a divorce. He never wavered in his devotion to his family, no matter how difficult things got. Given the idealized family picture he had grown up with, the breakdown of his marriage hit him like a ton of bricks. Rick was granted custody of their youngest son, Sam, after the divorce, while Kristen was the primary custodian for the other children. During an already difficult time in Rick's profession, the emotionally taxing divorce and custody battles piled even more stress. The demands of Rick's career, which required him to tour constantly, were at odds with his family obligations, as pointed out by Thompson. He had fallen out of favor as an arena performer. A punishing program of one-nighters across the nation was demanded of him as he played smaller venues. Even for young musicians, like Rick, who was in his 40s and dealing with the mental and physical demands of family life, that type of touring is tiring. But on a personal level, Nelson appeared to be doing better by 1985. He found fresh joy in his life when he started dating animal rights activist and model Helen Blair. Nelson never formally proposed, despite being wrongly characterized as his fiancée. An essential stabilizing presence, Blair had emerged. Nelson was said by his friends to be in a good mood, thinking forward and concerned about his health. According to Selvin, Rick looked fantastic in that last year. His drug use had drastically decreased. He was exercising consistently, and he was enthusiastic about forthcoming initiatives. More actively involved and future-oriented than in years, he was speculating about new recordings and had concepts for music videos. With an optimistic outlook, Nelson hopped aboard his own plane on December 31, 1985, and flew to Dallas, Texas, for his New Year's Eve performance. In addition to sound technician Donald Clark Russell, Blair was accompanied by band members Andy Chapin, Bobby Neal, Rickenfeld, and Clark Russell. Ken Ferguson and Brad Rank were the pilots. Unbeknownst to the passengers, this ordinary trip would tragically end in a narrative of misinformation, speculation, and cover-up that would drag on for decades, threatening to eclipse Nelson's musical legacy. The inexplicable demise. When Rick Nelson bought his Douglas DC-3 in 1985, it was already a historical artifact. This plane, which was built in 1944, was repurposed for civilian usage after serving in World War II. Although the DC-3 had been deemed unfit for commercial use by the 1980s, its roominess, dependability, and cheap operating expenses kept it popular among individual owners. Thomas Reynolds, an aviation expert, says that the DC-3 was a workhorse. With regular servicing, they could fly safely for decades because of how sturdy they were. Proper upkeep is the essential phrase. These were intricate planes that, especially as they got older, necessitated expert understanding and frequent maintenance checks. A cozy touring environment was created by equipping Nelson's DC-3 with modern avionics and furnishings. It had sleeping quarters, a mini kitchen, and a lounge space where the band could unwind while traveling from one tour stop to another. after taking off from Gunnersville, Alabama on December 31, 1985. The jet was supposed to make a New Year's Eve performance in Dallas, Texas, featuring Nelson and his Stone Canyon Band. Tragically, the plane was above Decatur, Texas, about 2 hours into the journey. The cabin was abruptly flooded with smoke, according to pilot Brad Rank's subsequent report. Unfortunately, the crew was unable to make it to the runway in time for the emergency landing attempt at a neighboring airfield in Texarkana. The DC-3 touched down in a wide field after crashing into a power line. Though injured, both pilots managed to escape the crash. Nelson Blair, 4 band members, and the sound engineer were among the 7 passengers who died as a result of smoke inhalation and burns. The tragedy quickly became more sinister when newspapers started claiming that the fire had been started by freebasing cocaine, a method that entails heating the substance with combustible substances. The narrative that these sensationalistic reports, based on anonymous sources alone, created has lasted long after they first appeared in mainstream media. The medical examiner who conducted Nelson's autopsy, Dr. Jerry Francisco, has stated that the rumors of freebasing were totally baseless. On the plane, we did not find any signs of drug paraphernalia. According to the toxicology findings, Nelson's system only contained trace amounts of cocaine metabolites, which is consistent with mild usage in the days leading up to the flight, and not active use while in flight. The tabloid stories exacerbated the suffering of Nelson's family and inflicted irreparable harm to his reputation. Both the real reason for the crash and Nelson's incredible musical legacy spanning 3 decades were overshadowed by the false narrative of drug-induced self-destruction. A broken gas heater in the cabin was officially named as the most probable cause of the incident, according to the National Transportation Safety Board's NTSB investigation. Significant contradictions and unresolved problems regarding the aircraft's mechanical condition did not prevent this explanation from being accepted at the time. Margaret Donovan, an aviation attorney who has studied the matter thoroughly, says that the NTSB probe was exceptionally superficial. They believed the pilot without proper evidence to back it up, didn't look into the plane's maintenance records, and came to a conclusion that didn't take witness accounts of the fire's origins and progression into consideration. Those closest to Nelson had their suspicions, but for decades the official story, a broken heater causing an accidental fire, was accepted without question in official circles. A new perspective on the tragedy has evolved, however, thanks to the evidence that has surfaced in the last several years, one that lays the blame at the feet of long-hidden systemic negligence rather than Nelson. According to Reynolds, Rick Nelson and the other passengers on that flight were not victims of human error or poor luck. Because of sloppy work, disregarded warnings, and a breakdown in the systems meant to keep planes safe, this happened. When the truth did come out, it would be much more upsetting than anyone had anticipated, not even the most ardent detractors. The cover-up is revealed an unexpected place, the regular digitalization of NTSB archives, gave a new generation of independent investigators access to materials that had been previously inaccessible, leading to the breakthrough in comprehending what really occurred to Rick Nelson's plane. Discrepancies in the Nelson case file that had not been sufficiently addressed in the first inquiry were discovered in 2018 by aviation forensics specialist Dr. Elizabeth Chen when examining past crash data. Inconsistencies between the official report and the raw investigative data were what first drew my attention, says Chen. Despite the NTSB's assertion that the plane's heater system was at fault, the agency's own evidence strongly disproved this conclusion. The re-examination conducted by Chen uncovered modifications to the DC-3's heating system that were in violation of FAA standards. A fire was practically assured to break out at some point due to the original system's altered state, which circumvented crucial safety mechanisms. According to Reynolds, who reviewed Chen's findings, the alterations were substantial and obviously harmful. The system had been improvised in ways that any competent mechanic would have seen as dangerous, including the removal of safety valves and the rerouting of fuel lines without enough insulation or protection. The fact that these harmful changes had been detected during earlier inspections but ignored is the most worrisome part. In the months leading up to the tragedy, pilots and mechanics had voiced concerns about the heating system on many occasions, according to maintenance logs that were briefly reviewed in the initial investigation. According to what Chen has uncovered, a mechanic had written a memo 3 weeks prior to the accident that expressly warns about the cabin heating system's potential fire hazards. The phrase "accident waiting to happen" is emphasized twice, and the system should be changed before any more flights can be conducted. It seems like these warnings were disregarded, and the plane kept flying without getting the repairs that were needed. People who worked for the aviation maintenance firm in the past have spoken out, stating that in order to save money and time, concerns about safety were frequently disregarded and shortcuts were commonplace. A former mechanic who worked on Nelson's DC-3 and asked to remain anonymous owing to continuing legal worries, said that there was continual pressure to bring the planes back in operation as soon as feasible. Concerns concerning safety were dismissed or promised that they would be addressed soon after we voiced them. "If it's still in the air, that's okay," was the general attitude. Unapproved items were found inside the cabin, which further increased the danger. Synthetic panels and materials used in the DC-3's retrofitting did not adhere to aviation fire safety regulations. Compared to the materials required by regulations, these ones burned faster and released more harmful smoke when the fire broke out. Reynolds said the cabin was basically a trap that might have killed them. The passengers' chances of survival were extremely low once fire reached the non-compliant items. Even in a well-equipped plane, the thick smoke would have been hard to see, and the fire would have spread much faster. Most shockingly, Chen uncovered internal messages that indicate investigators may have been influenced to concentrate on possible drug usage instead of mechanical faults during the initial examination. There is evidence of top-down pressure to focus on drunkenness angles and downplay maintenance inquiries in handwritten notes from a lead investigator. Chen draws the conclusion that the victims were intentionally targeted in an attempt to deflect responsibility. It suited the storyline that rock stars used narcotics. It validated preconceived notions and took focus off the systemic issues that contributed to the disaster. This deflection was useful for more than one thing. It offered a straightforward, sensationalized explanation that the media could readily market to the public, while also protecting the maintenance businesses from any potential liabilities and the FAA from accusations of insufficient control. According to Donovan, the truth is considerably more unsettling than the myths that people have accepted for many years. It wasn't carelessness or poor luck that killed Rick Nelson and the other 6. Their deaths were caused by individuals who were responsible for ensuring their safety failing to do so, and then covering up their mistakes. I remember him constructing it about 1938 or 9 or some such year, and then he got careless and let it fall apart. All things considered, these disclosures have been devastating and vindication for the Nelson family. The children of Rick have finally uncovered proof of the truth, after decades of hearing falsehoods about their father's death and the damage it did to his image. However, there is little solace in this reality. Matthew Nelson expressed in a recent interview that he had recently learned the heartbreaking truth that his father's death could have been prevented. This story has persisted for a long time, suggesting that Dad's personal decisions, or the rock and roll lifestyle, had something to do with the crash. It was completely unrelated to him, as we now know. That was just carelessness. The Nelson family has been fighting for years for the truth to be acknowledged, and the people responsible for the plane's condition to be held accountable. The passage of time has hampered their endeavors. The firms in charge of the aircraft's maintenance have either gone out of business or lost all involvement due to the high number of deaths that have occurred. According to Donovan, an aviation attorney, the time restriction for pursuing civil liability claims has long since passed. Right now, money isn't the driving force behind the Nelsons' quest. This is all about correcting the past and making sure that misconceptions surrounding Rick Nelson's death don't define his legacy. Aside from being inaccurate about the past, those misleading accounts had actual, tangible effects. They molded Nelson's legacy, frequently minimizing his groundbreaking music spanning 3 decades to a cautionary tale about the perils of stardom gone wild. Musicologist Parker is adamant that Rick Nelson should be remembered for his music and his tenacity as an artist. He was an early rock and roll pioneer, a late 60s country rock trailblazer, and an artist who refused to compromise his principles when it would have been easy to cash in on nostalgia. The sensationalized reporting of his death and the subsequent spread of false stories overshadowed his lasting impact. New information regarding the crash's actual cause has brought attention to larger concerns over aviation safety, which is of particular concern for touring musicians who frequently use privately owned or chartered planes to keep up with their demanding schedules. Parker makes the somber observation that the Nelson crash fits into a tragic pattern in the history of music, citing the plane crashes that killed Buddy Holly, Otis Redding, Aaliyah of Lynyrd Skynyrd, and countless more. Because they are always on the go and depend on others to keep them safe in transit, musicians are especially susceptible to these dangers. The proof of how well the truth was masked is what makes Nelson's case especially unsettling. There was an obvious effort to shift responsibility away from systemic failings, beginning with the careless dissemination of drug rumors in the media without supporting proof, and continuing with an insufficient inquiry that missed glaring safety violations. This instance exemplifies a systemic injustice. Donovan says that Rick Nelson and everyone else on board that flight were betrayed 3 times. At the outset, by individuals who neglected the plane's upkeep. The second is that the investigators didn't do their jobs properly. And the third is that the media shifted the responsibility onto the victims, instead of the people who were really at fault. Concerns regarding persistent safety difficulties, especially with older aircraft that are still in private hands without the strict regulation seen in commercial flying, are highlighted by aviation professionals in this case. Reynolds points out that later laws dealt with the particular problems with Nelson's DC-3. However, the fundamental issues, such as a lack of regulation of private planes, demands to keep maintenance expenses down, and a propensity to place responsibility on operators instead of looking at systemic failures, persist even now. It was actually that, even if the booing occurred, I was never really into the show or the legacy. Nearing 40 years after his terrible death in a violent accident in a Texas field, Rick Nelson's musical legacy is slowly coming into its own. His groundbreaking albums have been rediscovered by younger generations, and music historians have justifiably reinstated his status as a pivotal role in the history of rock and roll. In the early 1990s, his sons Matthew and Gunnar became the rock duet Nelson. They became the only family, aside from the Carpenters, to have #1 songs by different generations when they scored with Can't Live Without Your Love and Affection. They have gone to great lengths, through interviews and performances, to pay tribute to their father's music and dispel myths surrounding his life and passing. An authentic artist who ignored fads in favor of his own work, our father was the actual article. According to Matthew Nelson, the circumstances of his death don't define him. His courage as an artist, his innovations as a musician, and his dignity as a man, that's his true legacy. New information regarding Ricky Nelson's death finally puts an end to decades of unfair speculation and puts blame where it rightfully belongs for the millions of people who enjoyed watching his TV shows or listening to his popular music. Unfortunately, this fact also brings its own unease, as it compels us to face unsettling truths of responsibility and security that go well beyond this particular catastrophe. Even when they're solved, some mysteries remain unsolved. Selvin notes that they incite anger. When we learn the reality about Rick Nelson's situation, we should be furious. We might wonder how many other catastrophes have been portrayed in a similar light. I don't know how many people have been held responsible for tragedies that they weren't even involved in. So, the last chapter of Rick Nelson's story is about more than just making things right for one man. The issue at hand is our inclination to prioritize simplistic explanations over nuanced facts, to place blame on individuals rather than underlying causes, and to allow individuals in positions of authority to evade duty and accountability. Both his life and his death were befitting of the youngster who sprang from humble beginnings in an American living room, helped popularize rock and roll, and battled for recognition through his unwavering artistic commitment. The revelation of his last flight's truth does not take away the sorrow of his death, but it does return a priceless treasure. Honor is being remembered for one's own self, rather than one's death or the opinions of others. Perhaps the most suitable tribute to the late rock pioneer and child star Rick Nelson is his restored dignity. Nelson became a symbol of musical endurance.